The second of the great Greek tragedians was Sophocles. We don't know Sophocles' exact birth date, but he lived to be a very elderly man, into his 90s, 91 years or so, we believe. The exact date and the exact place of his birth is unknown, but we know that he was approximately 30 years younger than Aeschylus, and about 15 years older than Euripides, to try to get those three in order. His father, Sophocles, was a wealthy arms manufacturer in Colonus, so we think that Colonus was probably his birthplace. And he was born 5 years or so before the Battle of Marathon, while Athens was still ruled by a tyrant. You'll remember from our social context lecture that didn't have its current meaning yet, but just a sort of self-appointed king. At the age of 16, when the Athenians won the Battle of Salamis and therefore forever put off the invasion of the Persians and won the independence of the Greek continent, he was chosen to lead the paean. It's a choral chant to a god celebrating the Greek victory. This battle turns out to be an important date for all three, that ties together all three of the great tragedians. Aeschylus fought in this battle. Sophocles was really announced as an adult. He was kind of a debutante when he was chosen to lead this paean, and said that Euripides was born on the very day of the battle. He was an actor as well as a playwright, and he performed in his own plays and in others' plays. He was very famous for a juggling act that he performed in Nausicaa, and that was so fascinating to his audience that it was talked about for many, many years, and there are many references to this, quite independent of his skills and their admiration for him as a playwright. He was also a lyre player, something like a harp, and his official portrait shows him playing one. He was a patron of the arts, in fact, across a broad range of art, music, dancing, juggling, playwriting, acting. It was Sophocles who introduced the third actor, and you'll remember from our historic overview that in Greek theater there were never more than 3 actors, aside from the chorus, in any play. Only 3 individual speakers. Aristotle also credits Sophocles with the introduction of scene painting. You can see in the bottom slide there a periaktoi, one of those triangular columns that has a different scene painted on the face of each one. We don't actually know what Greek scene painting looked like, and it may not have been that realistic. But whatever it looked like, it was Sophocles who first invented the idea that the scenery could be painted and changed. Sophocles wrote 123 plays whose titles we know during the course of his life. He might have written even more than that. And he was selected as a competitor in around 30 competitions. Aeschylus lived long enough to compete against him many times. Aeschylus himself won about 14 competitions, but Sophocles was the winningest playwright in history. He won, it looks like 24 of the 30 competitions that he entered, and it was said that he was never judged lower than second place. By contrast, Euripides, who became much more famous than either of his predecessors eventually, won relatively few competitions, only 4, that he entered, and in truth 2 of those were after he died. They were for posthumous entries, so during his own lifetime Euripides only saw himself win twice. There's a top 7 plays for Sophocles, just like there is for Aeschylus, and these include a very early play called Ajax And among the things that's most interesting about this play is that it ends with an onstage suicide. So what we think of as the rule that violence is kept offstage in the Greek theater may really not be completely true. It may simply be that the plays that are retained for us, this small number that are still extant, except for Ajax, all banished the violence. But it may have been much more common than we now realize. His famous play Antigone, also a fairly early play in his career. It's often, because it's about the daughter of Oedipus, it's often paired with that play as part of a trilogy, but it's not in fact truly part of the same trilogy. It was written much, much earlier and belonged to a separate trilogy in its own time. Women of Trachis, a very odd play about the death of Hercules and the way in which his wife accidentally murdered him. It's a very complicated and I think somewhat strange play, very rarely produced now. Of course, his most famous play is the play that is generally referred to as Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King. In his own time, it was only thought of as Oedipus. In fact, Greek plays well after the period that we think of as the classical period didn't have titles at all, really. They didn't need them. They weren't thinking that plays would be revived, so it's sort of like, you know, episodes of that sitcom Friends used to be, like the one about Hercules, the one about Oedipus. We now call this play Oedipus the King because, as you'll soon see, he wrote a second Oedipus play, Oedipus Colonus, and we need a way to tell them apart. The Greek title for this would be Oedipus Tyrannus, but it was never used in his own time, or translated into Latin, Oedipus Rex. Electra is a late play on the same subject as Aeschylus's play, The Libation Bearers, the Coephori, which is the second play in the Oresteia. Philoctetes, another sort of strange play about a warrior on his way to the Trojan War who owns a magic bow and arrow, but his Greek colleagues abandon him, exile him to an island and abandon him, which turns out to be a very bad plan for them because eventually they need him and his magic arrows. And the final of his 7 plays, a play written when he was some 90 years old and produced actually after he died, actually, by his grandson. Also about Oedipus, but in Oedipus' extreme old age, when he has come to the grove at Colonus as a blind old man to review his life. We also have this papyrus, which is, we know to be about his satyr play, The Trackers. You can tell that it's very torn up and incomplete, but we do have a small section of this particular satyr play, and scholars have done a huge amount of work given how little evidence there is here. But it gives you a sense of what a Greek play would have looked like. You'll notice the letters stretching straight across the page with no spaces for words, no punctuation of any sort, no speech headings, just a string of letters that all have to be figured out and decoded by scholars later. Sophocles was not just a playwright, he was very, very important in the life of Athens. He was elected as one of the 10 strategoi, the sort of, we call them councilmen, and at one point he also served as one of the treasurers of Athena, helping to manage the finances of the city. And this was during the period, the political period of Pericles, the great ruler of classical Athens. He was also apparently a warrior, served as a general in the war against the island of Samos. And he founded the cult of Asclepius in Athens by setting up an altar in his home until the temple was actually complete. That is, he was important as a political figure, he was important as a religious figure, he was important as a military figure, and he was important as an artistic figure. He was an amazing, complex Renaissance man. He was also very interesting and is still much discussed for his private life. He had 2 wives, a son by each one of them, and one of his sons, Iophon, also became a playwright. But like most Greek men at this time, he was certainly bisexual, as were all of the 3 great Greek tragedians. But the stories about Sophocles are very specific, that he was not satisfied, he did not find satisfactory the typical Greek arrangement of an older man who trained a young boy, took a young boy as his lover, and then raised him up to manhood, imparted some wisdom, and then let him go. Sophocles remained very fond of his partners well into their adulthood and well past the age in which they were such age that they were thought that they should take their own young boy lovers. And for this reason, he's very, very interesting to us as a figure in this debate between the people who think of sexuality as a social construction and those who think of it as an essential quality about us, and the essentialists. So in modern times, some of these records about Sophocles' private life have become quite fascinating to us in the whole field of queer theory and gay and lesbian studies. In his old age, it is said that his 2 sons tried to have him declared incompetent so that they could seize his assets, and it's said that he managed to refute their charges in court by reading from his final play, Oedipus at Colonus, which demonstrated that he still had it at the age of 87 or 88, whatever. But the play was not produced, Oedipus at Colonus was not produced until 4 years after his death, when a grandson produced this play, and it managed to win the competition in that year. But it was a very long life, 90 years, and saw all the way from, as a young man, the triumph of Greece over the Persians, Athens over the Persians, all the way through to its fall in the Peloponnesian Wars, when it had quit being the classical and great city that it had once been. Like Aeschylus, he has a famous epitaph. This one does mention the fact that he's a playwright. Blessed is Sophocles, who had a long life, was a man both happy and talented, and a writer of many good tragedies. And he ended his life well without suffering any misfortune. You may remember that there's a famous quote in Oedipus Rex that said, "Let no man count himself lucky until the day of his death." That you can have a very long and good life and still not turn out to be totally good. It can end badly, but he wrote his own epitaph to say that didn't happen to him. He was fortunate throughout his life. So there you have the second of the great 3 Greek tragedians.